85 million people read Matt Shumer's AI essay in 2 weeks. He named the moment, he didn't name the move. I'm going to name it. It's Claude Code, and more specifically, the ability to author what are called skills. A skill is a plain English file that tells Claude how to do one repeating piece of your job. Every week it runs. Every week you stop typing the same request. By minute 7, you'll know exactly what a skill is and why authoring one is different from using Claude in chat. By minute 12, you'll have a 20-minute first step you can run this weekend. No teasing, no hype. In 18 months, the senior professional who still only prompts Claude becomes a translator between her firm and its AI tools. The one who authors Claude Code Skills becomes the person the firm sends its hardest problems to. That's the fork this video is about. 6 weeks ago, an AI founder named Matt Shumer published an essay. He called it "Something Big is Happening." 85 million people read it on X inside 2 weeks. Fortune wrote it up, Bloomberg quoted it, Citrini Research hung a $300 billion market sell-off on the same phrase. If you work in knowledge work and you're over 35, you've either read that essay or you've read something that was quoting it. The essay named the moment, it didn't name the move. I am going to name the move. It's Claude Code. And more specifically, it's the specific capability inside Claude Code that almost nobody is saying out loud yet, which is the ability to author what are called skills. By the end of this explanation, you'll know 3 things: what a skill is, why authoring one is different from using Claude in chat, and a 20-minute first step you can run this weekend, no teasing. Think of it like building on ground Shumer already cleared. He named the floor, and now we pour the foundation. That's the standard answer. I'm about to tell you why the standard answer is almost completely wrong for anyone who actually wants agency in this window. Most people watching this are already using Claude every week. You open Claude.ai, you paste a transcript, you ask for a summary, you draft a tricky email, you compress a 30-page deck into 3 bullet points for your boss. It works, it's faster than doing it by hand, so you probably believe that using Claude daily means you're keeping up with AI. Most people conclude exactly that. That conclusion feels right because every single one of those tasks returned a usable result. The output is good, the time saved is real. And if the measure is how the tool performs in a single conversation, daily use is fluency. But there's a second kind of fluency that doesn't show up in a chat window, and the people who are quietly multiplying their leverage right now aren't chatting. The gap is between 2 different capabilities. One is user fluency. You open a chat, you type a request, you get output, you close the tab. The next morning, Claude has forgotten everything you said. You start over. Every day looks like the day before. Your output per hour goes up a little and then it plateaus. The other is author fluency, which means writing a reusable instruction rather than prompting once. You write a file, a plain English file, you save it in a folder on your computer, Claude reads it, follows it, runs it every Monday at 9 a.m. Then you write another file that calls the first file, then a third that calls the second. After 6 weeks, you've a small library of files that do the repeatable parts of your job without you sitting there typing. Chat fluency compounds linearly. Author fluency compounds exponentially because skills invoke other skills. That isn't marketing language. Simon Willison, the programmer who co-created Django, has been publishing his own skill files publicly for the last 6 months. You can read them, they are short, they are English, nothing in them requires a computer science degree. I'll walk you through one of his files later, stay with me for that. Using Claude daily isn't keeping up, authoring skills is, that's the whole game. But if that's true, what does authoring actually look like on a Monday morning? That's the part nobody tells you. Here's the one idea I want you to leave with. Shumer named the moment. The move inside the moment is authoring Claude Code Skills. Let me put the whole thing on one desk so you can see it. You already know what a case memo is. If you've spent any time inside a consulting firm, a law firm, a strategy team, or a serious marketing org, someone has handed you a one-page document. That document said, here's the task, here's the format, here's the expected length, here's the tone, here's the one example of how it should look. That document is a contract with a junior associate. The junior reads it, produces the work, and the partner reviews a consistent output instead of 12 different interpretations. A Claude Code skill works the same way as that case memo. The junior is Claude. The document is called skill.md. It's a markdown file, which is nothing more than a plain text file with some light formatting conventions. A skill is a plain markdown file written in English saved in a folder that tells Claude how you want a repeating task done. Every serious knowledge worker who wants agency in the next 18 months writes them. That's the whole game. You write it once, you save it in a folder on your computer that Claude Code can see, and from then on, every time you tell Claude Code to run that skill, it reads your contract and produces the work the way you specified it. This is where most people quit. The ones who don't find this. That isn't a metaphor. That's mechanically what's happening. This isn't a new pattern. It's the third time I've watched it in my own career. In 2011, I was at IBM. I watched senior architects who refused to learn cloud get quietly routed into what the company called legacy support. It was a 3-year road to voluntary exit. In 2018, I was at Nike. I watched the same shape play out with mobile-first thinking. The people who adopted early became the product leaders. The people who waited for someone to explain it to them were restructured out. Today, I'm watching it for the third time with Claude Code Skills. The pattern is identical. The signal is identical. The move is the same. Author before you're authored. Claude Code, in case the name is new, it's Anthropic's file-aware interface to Claude. It's the same model you already use in chat. The difference is it can read the folders on your computer, write files back out, and follow instructions you've written down. Until recently, it needed a terminal to run. In January, Anthropic shipped a desktop app called Cowork for Mac. On April 3rd, 3 weeks ago, they shipped it for Windows. That launch is why everyone who didn't care about this a quarter ago is suddenly eligible to care about it now. So, 1. Skill runs one task. That's the floor. The foundation is what happens when you've 10 of them. Each skill you write can invoke another skill. You write a skill called weeklyreview.md that summarizes last week's meetings. You write a second skill called clientreport.md that turns that summary into a client-facing PDF. You write a third called bossupdate.md that turns the same summary into a 4-bullet Slack message for your boss. The third one calls the second one, which calls the first. You do the thinking once, the skills do the shipping every week after that. History backs this. In 1985, Lotus 123 and the spreadsheet reached every finance department in America. Time had already named the personal computer machine of the year. Accountants who adopted spreadsheets became the chief financial officers of 2000. Accountants who dismissed spreadsheets as not real accounting were gone by 1995. 10 years. That was the whole transition. In 1995, Netscape and Windows 95 made the internet a mainstream office tool. Newsweek called its December cover, "This changes everything." The non-technical knowledge workers who learned basic HTML and understood what a web page was became the digital transformation leads of their firms by 2000. The print-first marketing directors who treated the web as a fad were restructured out by the 2001 cycle. 6 years. That was the whole transition. Claude Code Skills looks like those windows. The evidence points the same direction. PwC's 2025 Global AI Jobs Barometer reports that workers with AI skills command a 56% wage premium over peers, up from 25% the prior year. Job postings requiring AI literacy grew 70% year over year. KPMG's 2026 Workforce Survey reports 40% of workers now name AI-driven job loss as their primary fear, nearly doubled year over year. CNBC reported in February that the highest income workers, the $80,000 to $300,000 band, are more afraid than lower income workers. The people with the most to lose see it clearest. Ethan Mollick, the Wharton professor who wrote Co-Intelligence, has been making the identity shift publicly for 6 months. His newsletter, One Useful Thing, reaches 500,000 subscribers. He moved from the language of AI researcher to the language of someone who builds with Claude Code. His essay, Claude Code and What Comes Next, circulated inside Fortune 500 strategy teams in the first quarter. He did this in front of his audience with receipts, no coding background required, a tenured management professor. The mechanism is simple, the window is narrow, the move is to write files. There's a second reason most professionals miss this window, and it's the one that actually matters. But first, you need to see where skills don't work, because the misapplications are what turn this from leverage into busy work. A skill isn't the right tool for every kind of work. I want to be precise about when this applies and when it doesn't. Skills work when your output is primarily text, numbers, or analysis. Memos, models, research summaries, client emails, status reports, pricing decisions, hiring rubrics, meeting notes, they work when you can articulate in writing what good output looks like. If you can brief a junior associate on a task, you can write a skill.md for that task, and they work when the task recurs more than twice a month. The whole point is the compounding. A one-off analysis isn't worth encoding. Skills break when the work requires physical presence. A surgeon, a plumber, a teacher in a live classroom, a therapist reading a room, the work is the presence and there's no file that replaces that. They break when the work is genuinely novel every time with zero usable structure. If every engagement starts from a blank page, a skill has nothing to encode. And they break when you can't articulate your own quality standard. Claude amplifies whatever you write down. If your standard is fuzzy, the output is fuzzy. 2 common mistakes. Trying to skillify a one-off analysis when Claude Chat is the right tool for one-offs, and writing a skill too loose if every run requires heavy editing, the skill wasn't actually written. Tighten the instructions, add one example, and try again. Here's what Monday morning actually looks like. 20 minutes, start to finish. Step 1. Install Claude Code Desktop. The free tier is enough to start. If you're on a Mac, it has been available since January 12th. If you're on Windows, the Windows build shipped April 3rd. Both installs are under 5 minutes. Second, open any folder on your computer that contains work you do repeatedly, a folder called Weekly Reports, a folder of client memos, a folder where last month's analyses live. It doesn't matter which folder as long as the work inside is representative of something you do every week or every month. Third, write one file called skill.md inside that folder, 4 sections, what the task is in 1 sentence, what the input is, the files in the folder, the format of the data, whatever Claude needs to read, what the output should look like, format, length, tone, one example, what to never do, the quality rules that are usually unwritten. Finally, tell Claude Code to run your skill, watch the output, adjust one line in the skill.md file, run it again. Within 20 minutes, you've a working first skill and a file you can reuse every Monday for as long as the task exists. That's the whole first step. One folder, one file, one run, tonight or this weekend. Shumer named the moment you just named your first skill. If you want the checklist I use to decide whether a task is skill-worthy, the 4-question filter that tells me inside 30 seconds whether a Monday task should become a skill.md file or stay in chat, I put together a free resource, link in the description. For the professionals building this with me week by week, I run a community called Agent Skills Academy. Free to join, that's where members share the skills they shipped this week, swap skill.md files, and post the mistakes that made their skills tighter. Comment skill below and I'll send you a sample skill.md file, a real one I wrote for my weekly review. Copy it, change 3 lines, that's your starting point.